When I moved into the old house on the edge of town, I thought it would be the perfect place to escape from my hectic city life. The house was grand and stately, with a sweeping front lawn and a wide porch that seemed to invite relaxation. The rent was surprisingly low for such a large property, but I was too eager for peace to question why. I was desperate for a place to unwind, to be alone with my thoughts after the upheaval of my recent breakup. The house itself was a Victorian masterpiece, with intricate woodwork, high ceilings, and expansive windows that let in plenty of light. The previous owner had left it in a state of disrepair, but I saw potential. I set to work cleaning and restoring it, enjoying the physical labor and the solitude. The first few weeks were blissfully uneventful. I explored the house, uncovering its old charm beneath layers of dust and neglect. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten items, old trunks, dusty books, and strange trinkets. I didn't pay much attention to the latter. They seemed like remnants of someone's life that had been abandoned along with the house. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. I saw a shadow moving across one of the upper windows. I looked up, but the window was empty. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the play of light and shadows from the setting sun. However, the shadow returned each night, just as dusk settled in. I would catch a glimpse of it moving across the window, a dark, amorphous shape that seemed to drift and shift. It was never there long enough for me to get a clear look. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination playing tricks on me, or perhaps a trick of the light. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate the shadow. I climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor, the old wood groaning under my weight. I moved quietly down the dimly lit hallway, following the path the shadow seemed to take. My heart raced with a mix of excitement and dread. As I approached the window, I could see my own reflection in the glass, but the shadow was nowhere to be seen. I inspected the room, checking for anything that might cast unusual shadows. A loose curtain, a moving object, but found nothing. The shadow continued to appear night after night, growing more persistent and menacing. It seemed to move with purpose now, its shape more defined, more aggressive. The dark form was no longer amorphous. It began to resemble something more substantial, more sinister. I started to experience strange occurrences. Items in the house would go missing, only to reappear in odd places. The temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms, leaving me shivering despite the warm weather outside. I heard whispers in the dark, faint and unintelligible, but always just at the edge of my hearing. I was no longer alone. The shadow grew bolder. It began to press against the window, as if trying to get in. The glass would fog up, and I would see dark, distorted shapes pressing against the surface, leaving streaks of grime and condensation. It was as if something was trying to force its way inside. One night, I decided to confront it. I armed myself with a flashlight and a crowbar, determined to uncover whatever was casting the shadow. I made my way to the window, my hand shaking as I gripped the flashlight. I pulled open the curtains and aimed the light at the window, but the shadow was gone. The window was clear, and there was nothing outside but the empty yard. I breathed a sigh of relief, but as I turned to leave, I felt a cold, clammy hand grasp my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, but the air was heavy with a malevolent presence. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I stumbled back to the stairs, my mind racing. I had to get out of the house. I was convinced that something was terribly wrong, that whatever was in the house had taken a personal interest in me. I grabbed my keys and phone, but as I reached the door, it slammed shut on its own. The house was no longer willing to let me leave. Panic set in. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no sound came out. It was as if the walls themselves had swallowed my cries. I turned to face the house, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it. The shadow was back, but it wasn't just on the window anymore. It had spread, creeping along the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was everywhere. An inky, dark mass that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The shadows writhed and twisted, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to leer and jeer at me. Desperately, I tried to find another way out. I ran through the house, searching for an exit, but every door and window was sealed shut, the shadows pressing against them, blocking any escape. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, growing more insistent, more terrifying. They were no longer just whispers. They were voices, angry and accusing, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. In the hallway, I saw it clearly for the first time. The shadow wasn't just a shape, it was a presence. It was a dark, malevolent entity that seemed to feed off fear, a being that had been waiting for someone like me to come along. It had been trapped in the house for years, maybe decades, feeding on the terror of its previous occupants, and now it had turned its attention to me. I was trapped. I could feel the shadows closing in around me, tightening their grip, pressing me against the walls. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I could make out words now. Fragments of sentences that spoke of suffering and despair, of people who had come before me and never left. In a final, desperate act, I grabbed the crowbar and smashed the nearest window, the glass shattering in a shower of sharp shards. I climbed through the broken window, cutting my hands and arms on the jagged edges, but I didn't care. I was determined to escape no matter the cost. I fell onto the grass outside, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The shadow pressed against the window, its dark form pushing through the broken glass, reaching for me. I scrambled away, stumbling to my car, and drove as far as I could from the house. I spent the night in a motel, but even there, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. I kept expecting to see the shadow in the corners of the room, in the reflection of the mirror. I knew that whatever had been in that house was still out there, still searching for me, still feeding on the fear it had cultivated. In the days that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me. I moved to a new place, far from that house, but I could never fully escape the feeling of dread that had taken hold of me. The shadows had become a part of my nightmares, a dark reminder of what I had faced. Sometimes, when I look out my new windows at night, I catch a glimpse of a shadow moving across the glass. It's never there long, always fleeting, but the sight is enough to make my blood run cold. I can't help but wonder if the shadow is still following me, still waiting for the right moment to return. And every now and then, when the night is particularly quiet, I can hear those whispers again. They're faint, just barely audible, but they're always there. A chilling reminder that the darkness I escaped from is never truly gone. The rain was coming down in torrents. I could barely see through the windshield, even with the wipers swiping frantically back and forth. It was the kind of downpour that turns streets into rivers, the kind that makes you squint just to make out the headlights of oncoming cars. I was already running late for work, trying to push my old sedan through the storm without skidding off the road. My nerves were shot. That's when I saw him. A man, drenched head to toe, standing by the side of the road with his thumb out. He looked desperate, water pouring off his jacket as he stood beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp. For a split second, I debated whether to stop. Every part of my brain screamed not to. It wasn't safe. Picking up strangers was something I'd sworn never to do. But something about his hunched, defeated posture and the way the rain was practically drowning him made me hesitate. I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down the passenger window just a crack. The rain immediately splashed into the car, soaking my arm as I leaned over. "You need a ride?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the downpour. He nodded, his face mostly hidden beneath the hood of his jacket. "Please, just need to get home." My car broke down. I hesitated again, my instincts gnawing at me, but I unlocked the door anyway. He climbed in quickly, bringing with him the smell of wet earth and something else. Something metallic. I tried not to breathe it in as I glanced at him. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there dripping and staring straight ahead. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his gaunt frame, and he shivered violently. I couldn't see his face clearly under the hood, but from the little I could make out, his skin was pale, almost sickly. I started driving again, focusing on the road. The storm wasn't letting up, and I figured the sooner I got this guy to where he needed to go, the better. The sound of the rain pounding on the roof filled the silence between us, and I kept my hands tightly gripped on the wheel, sneaking occasional glances at him out of the corner of my eye. After a few minutes, I realized he hadn't given me an address. "Where are you heading?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. My unease was growing with every second that ticked by. He turned his head slowly, the movement almost unnatural, like it hurt to shift his neck. His voice was low, barely above a whisper. "Keep going straight." That was it. No details, no explanation. I forced a smile, even though he couldn't see it. Okay, sure. How far?" "Not far," he muttered. The vague answer made my stomach knot up. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just shaken up from the rain, grateful for a ride. I focused on the road, driving through the empty streets. The rain hammered against the car, the rhythmic thud-thud of the wipers the only other sound. We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity. The houses grew sparser, the streetlights fewer and farther between. I didn't recognize where we were anymore. "You, live out here?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going, hoping to pierce the thickening tension inside the car. "Not far," he repeated, his voice flat. Something about the way he said it made me grip the wheel tighter. I stole another glance at him. He hadn't moved since he got in, his hands resting in his lap, his hood still pulled low over his face. But there was something off about him. His clothes were all wrong. They didn't look like they belonged to him. Too big, too worn. The jacket was a size too large, sleeves hanging loosely over his wrists, and his jeans. There were dark stains on them. I told myself it was mud, just mud from walking along the side of the road in the rain, but there was a nagging feeling deep in my gut, a sinking certainty that it wasn't mud. Suddenly, the smell hit me again, that metallic, sickly odor, stronger this time, filling the car and making my stomach turn. I tried not to gag, rolling down the window slightly to let in some fresh air. The rain splattered in again, but I didn't care. I needed to breathe something other than that awful, clinging stench. He shifted in his seat, and I stiffened. I didn't want to look at him, but I could feel his eyes on me now, watching me. My heart began to race, pounding in my chest like a trapped bird trying to escape. "Turn left," he said suddenly. I glanced around. There wasn't a left. The road stretched on straight ahead, bordered by dense trees on either side. But there was no turnoff. I slowed the car, trying to see through the sheets of rain. "There's no left," I said, my voice cracking. He leaned forward, and I felt his breath, hot and rancid, on my neck. "Turn left," he repeated, more forcefully this time. My blood ran cold. There was no road. He wanted me to drive into the trees, into the darkness. Panic surged in my chest, and I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had to think fast. I couldn't let him know I was scared. I can't see in this rain, I stammered. Are you sure it's up ahead? He didn't answer. Instead, his hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward his jacket pocket. My heart stopped. Was he reaching for a weapon? In that moment, I realized just how alone we were. No houses, no lights, just the road disappearing into the darkness ahead. No one would hear me scream. No one would come looking for me until it was too late. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning for a split second before they caught the wet pavement. The car lurched forward, the engine roaring as I sped down the narrow road. The man lurched back in his seat, caught off guard. But he didn't shout, didn't react like I thought he would. He just sat there, silent. Slow down, he said, his voice eerily calm. I ignored him, my foot pressing harder on the gas. I could barely see the road now, the rain blurring everything into a gray, featureless smear. But I didn't care. I had to get away from him, get to somewhere, anywhere that wasn't here. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement ahead. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car fishtailed, nearly spinning out of control. My heart leapt into my throat as I gripped the wheel, trying to steady it. There was someone standing in the road, a figure tall and thin, silhouetted in the rain. I blinked, trying to focus through the downpour. It was another man, just standing there, motionless, in the middle of the road. The car skidded to a halt inches from him. I stared, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Get out, the hitchhiker said, his voice a low growl now. I whipped around to face him, my breath catching in my throat. His hood had fallen back slightly, revealing more of his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes hollow and dark as if there was nothing behind them. Get out, he repeated, his lips curling into a thin, humorless smile. I looked back at the figure standing in the road. He hadn't moved, just stood there, staring at me, his face obscured by the rain. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline flooding my veins. I didn't have a choice. Slowly, I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling. The rain was pounding harder now, drowning out every other sound. I glanced at the man in the passenger seat one last time, and in that moment, something clicked. His hands, they weren't empty. In his right hand, clenched tightly against his thigh, was a knife. The blade was long and thin, stained with something dark. It wasn't rainwater. Before I could think, before I could even scream, he lunged at me. I threw open the door and scrambled out of the car, slipping in the mud as I hit the ground hard. My hands and knees stung as I pushed myself up, my heart racing so fast I thought it might explode. I could hear him behind me, the car door slamming as he stepped out into the rain. I didn't look back. I just ran. The rain was blinding, the wind howling in my ears as I sprinted down the road, my shoes slipping on the slick pavement. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest burning. I could hear his footsteps behind me. Steady, deliberate, never rushing but always there, always closer. There was nowhere to go. The road stretched on endlessly, the trees on either side looming like dark, twisted sentinels. No lights, no help, just me, the storm, and the man chasing me. Suddenly, I heard his voice again, but this time it wasn't behind me. It was ahead. Come back, he called, his voice mocking, playful. You're going the wrong way. My heart skipped a beat. I skidded to a stop, my legs trembling. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him. He was everywhere, his voice echoing in the rain, coming from every direction at once. I was trapped, and then, from the shadows, I saw the figure in the road again. When I accepted the invitation to the dinner party at the old mansion on the outskirts of town, I was intrigued. It was a grandiose estate that had always been shrouded in mystery and whispers. The invitation had arrived without a return address, just a simple card with ornate script. You are cordially invited to an evening of fine dining and delightful company. First, I thought it was a prank. The mansion had been empty for years. Its grandeur faded into dereliction. But my curiosity got the better of me. It seemed like a chance to experience something out of the ordinary, and I had been craving a change from my mundane routine. Besides, the invitation promised an evening of sophistication and elegance, something I couldn't resist. The day of the party arrived, and I dressed in my finest attire, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. The mansion loomed ahead as I drove up the long, winding driveway, its dark silhouette against the twilight sky giving it an almost otherworldly presence. The estate had a certain charm despite its age, with ivy creeping up the sides of the crumbling walls and a once grand fountain now overgrown with weeds. As I approached the front door, it creaked open before I could even touch the handle. The interior was dimly lit by flickering chandeliers, their light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. A butler, dressed in an impeccably formal uniform, greeted me with a courteous nod. "Welcome to the evening's festivities," he said in a voice that was polite but lacked warmth. He led me through the grand foyer and into the dining hall, where the other guests were already seated. The dining hall was a spectacle of opulence and decay. A long polished table was set with fine china and crystal goblets, the tablecloth pristine but frayed at the edges. The guests were dressed in formal attire, their faces a mixture of anticipation and weariness. They smiled and nodded politely as I entered, but there was something unsettling about their expressions, an emptiness that went beyond mere fatigue. The meal began, and as the first course was served, I couldn't help but notice the food. It was exquisite, perfectly cooked, beautifully presented, but there was an odd, unsettling quality to it. The flavors were rich, but the taste seemed strangely familiar, as if I had eaten it before. I tried to shake off the feeling and engaged in conversation with the other guests. As the evening wore on, the conversation became more strained, and the guests' laughter grew hollow. The food continued to arrive, each course more elaborate than the last, but with each bite, the sense of unease grew. The guests seemed increasingly preoccupied with the meal, their eyes fixated on their plates, their hands trembling as they ate. The butler appeared frequently, his presence almost ghostly, silently replacing empty dishes and refilling glasses. He moved with a disquieting efficiency, as if he were a machine rather than a person. His eyes, though polite, seemed distant and unseeing. Hours passed, and the night deepened. The dinner party was supposed to be a single evening affair, but as time went on, I began to realize that something was terribly wrong. The food never seemed to diminish no matter how much we ate. The same courses kept reappearing, as if they were being replenished from an infinite supply. The guests began to show signs of distress, nervous glances, frantic eating, a growing sense of desperation. It wasn't long before I started to notice other oddities. The decor of the room seemed to shift subtly when I wasn't looking. The portraits on the walls, once depicting serene landscapes, now showed unsettling scenes, distorted faces, anguished expressions. The flickering chandeliers cast grotesque shadows that seemed to move and writhe of their own accord. By midnight, the atmosphere had become suffocating. The guests were no longer engaging in conversation. They were simply shoveling food into their mouths, their eyes glazed over. I felt a deepening sense of dread, a growing realization that something horrific was unfolding. I tried to leave, but the doors to the dining hall were locked. I pounded on them, shouting for help, but my cries were swallowed by the oppressive silence. The butler appeared again, his face expressionless, informing me that the evening's festivities had only just begun. Desperation set in as the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was trapped in this nightmarish dinner party, forced to partake in an endless feast with no escape. The food, though delicious, had a metallic aftertaste that lingered unpleasantly in my mouth. My stomach churned with nausea, but I could not stop eating. It was as if something beyond my control compelled me to consume the endless array of dishes. The other guests were no better off. They were gaunt, their faces hollowed by exhaustion and fear. Their attempts to smile or engage in conversation were feeble, their voices little more than rasps. I saw the same terror in their eyes that I felt in my own. As the night dragged on, the food began to change. The dishes became less appetizing, their appearance increasingly grotesque. What had once been elegant fare now resembled the entrails of some unnameable beast. The once delicious flavors turned acrid, and the metallic taste grew stronger. I could barely stomach the sight or smell, but still, I was compelled to eat. The guests around me were deteriorating. Their bodies seemed to waste away, their clothing hanging loose on their skeletal frames. Their eyes, once bright with anticipation, were now dull and lifeless. The butler continued to serve, his expression unchanged, as if he were merely performing a function. The walls of the dining hall seemed to close in, their grandeur shrinking as the hours wore on. The room became stifling, the air heavy with the scent of decay. In a final desperate attempt to escape, I grabbed a chair and smashed one of the windows, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. I clambered through the broken window, cutting my hands and arms on the jagged edges, but I didn't care. I was driven by the primal need to escape, to be free of this infernal nightmare. Outside, the night was still and silent. The mansion loomed behind me, its windows dark and lifeless. I ran away from the estate, my heart pounding, my mind reeling from the horror I had experienced. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the streetlights, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked back once, but the mansion was gone. In its place was a desolate field, a place of overgrown grass and forgotten memories. There was no sign of the grandeur or the horror that had been there moments before. The experience left me shaken. I couldn't explain what had happened, only that I had been trapped in a never-ending dinner party, a nightmarish ritual from which there was no escape. The food, the guests, the butler, everything had been part of a malevolent, otherworldly trap. Since that night, I've been haunted by the memory of the feast, the endless consumption and the faces of the other guests, frozen in terror. I've tried to find out more about the mansion, but no one seemed to remember it. It had vanished as if it had never existed. Now, whenever I find myself in a formal setting or attending a dinner party, a shiver of dread runs down my spine. The scent of food, the sight of an elaborate table, all evoke the nightmarish memory of that endless feast. I am haunted by the fear that the mansion is still out there, waiting for its next guest, ready to trap them in its eternal horrific dinner party.